Hello, welcome to the newest installment of TCU Presents. Today we'll look back at the Vietnam War and particularly the experience of US service members during and after that conflict. I'm your moderator, Ethan Casey. I'm a journalist and a longtime friend of TCU. I'm co-editor with Major April E. Brown, who is TCU's Director of Veteran Services, of the book Voices of America, Veterans and Military Families Tell Their Own Stories, published by TCU Press in 2020. Voices of America was an extraordinary project that I got to be part of, and I recommend an article about it in TCU Magazine, published in 2021, if you want to learn more. It features 80 plus personal accounts by American military veterans and military family members, all of whom have some association with TCU. And most of them are post 9/11 from the service of the last 20 years. But April and I made a point of going back and including people from the first Gulf War, as well as peacetime service, and as far back as Vietnam and even World War II. So we actually interviewed a man, Alcy Chris, who had been a Montfort Point Marine during World War II, and that was an extraordinary thing to be able to, extraordinary person to be able to include in this wonderful book that, even though I edited it, I recommend it very highly. I was asked to say something about what I learned from editing that book, and the point that I think is relevant to today's session is that I'm a lifelong civilian, and if I had not had that opportunity to co-edit Voices of America, I would not have learned a lot of really important things about the human beings and my fellow Americans who take part in military service in America and on behalf of America, and who those people are and what military service does for them and does to them, and how that affects the rest of their lives, and who these people are. It's been an extraordinary and important personal education for me. And as I said a minute ago, that Vietnam is an important part of that book, and it's an important part of the American story overall. I published another book, or republished this book called The Experts, which is an extraordinary chronicle of the Vietnam War. And we don't have time to talk about it in full today, but I want to read a particular paragraph because I think it sets up this conversation. And after I read this paragraph, I'm going to introduce today's panelists. So this paragraph is from my introduction to the new edition of the book, The Experts by Clyde Edwin Pettit, chronicling the Vietnam War. And it's my own personal perspective as an American on Vietnam. I was born in 1965, the year the first officially acknowledged US combat troops went to Vietnam. The Experts opened my eyes to what had been going on in the world, even as I had been obliviously enjoying a rather idyllic middle-class American childhood. Coming into awareness of the wider world during the second half of the 1970s, I could smell that there was some kind of miasma or pall hanging over American society. I knew that its name was Vietnam, that there had been a war. And to be sure, American society did begin seeking that ever elusive goodie to which we feel somehow entitled, closure, around that time through films like The Deer Hunter, Coming Home, and Born on the 4th of July. But what never took place was any real communication about what exactly had happened and why, from my parents' generation to mine. And for that, I blame my parents' generation. All of them, whether they were, quote, for the war or, quote, against it. They agreed to disagree with each other. One side held up the edge of the carpet while the other swept the war under it. But none of them ever explained any of it to me. Perhaps others of my generation feel the same. As a friend who had been a draft age hippie protester late in the war said to me in exasperation, and only after I pressed him what the storied 60s were really all about was, quote, how the blood of the war got on everyone's hands and we couldn't wash it off. It's still all over the place. My friend said that to me in the mid 1990s, and now here we are a quarter of a century later and several wars later. And I think all the panelists in today's event will agree that the Vietnam War was and remains a very significant fact in American life and American societies. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce briefly each of the three panelists, and then we'll have a conversation. Fort Worth native Marty Leewright. Marty, why don't you say hello so you come on the screen and everybody sees you? There's Marty. Marty Leewright was a high school dropout when he entered the US Army one day after turning 17. He received orders for Vietnam the week after his 18th birthday. He spent his 18th, 19th, and part of his 20th years as a combat engineer during 2 tours in Vietnam. He was awarded the Army Commendation Medal for his actions during the 6-week invasion of Cambodia in 1970. After his military service, Marty earned 4 degrees, including a doctor of jurisprudence. He's been a Texas prosecutor and trial attorney for almost 40 years. He was appointed by the Chief Justice of the Texas Supreme Court to rewrite procedural rules for over 800 courts in Texas. He's a prolific author and frequent speaker at state bars, continuing legal education seminars and trainings for judges and court staff. He also teaches and speaks at law schools and universities, including at TCU. Our second panelist is Travis Vanderpool, who retired as a captain, but he emphasized in yesterday's rehearsal that when he was serving as a fighter pilot, he was a lieutenant. But he asked us to call him Travis. Captain Travis Vanderpool is a 1964 graduate of TCU. And Travis, where are you? There you are.
Right here. Howdy. How you doing?
Captain Travis Vanderpool is a 1964 graduate of TCU, where he was a member of the Air Force ROTC and served as the Cadet Corps commander. From a young age, he had dreamed of becoming a pilot. That dream came true, and he received his wings as a U.S. Air Force pilot in May 1966. He did not dream of entering a war in Asia, but he answered the call to service and arrived in Vietnam in 1967. Travis and the other 9 members of his training class were assigned to the 3rd Tactical Fighter Wing at Bien Hoa Air Force Base in Vietnam. 2 of his classmates were killed in action the first 3 months they were there. The rest made it home safely. During Captain Vanderpool's year in Vietnam, a year that included witnessing the Tet Offensive, and Brandon, maybe when it comes time for you to speak, if you could speak a little about the Tet Offensive. Those of us who know something about the war in Vietnam know that was a very significant time in the war. During that year, his year in Vietnam, Travis was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross 4 times. After returning to the States, he became a flight instructor and then pursued a second career as an attorney. After a successful career in Dallas, mostly as a trial attorney and a mediator, he became a member of the board of directors for the State Bar of Texas and eventually served as its chair. Thank you, Travis. And our third panelist is Captain Brandon Sultwish, who Brandon Sultwish, Lieutenant Colonel. I'm sorry, I called him a Lieutenant Colonel. Travis was a captain. This is very important. Brandon Sultwish is a Lieutenant Colonel. He assumed responsibility as the professor and chair of the Department of Military Science at TCU and at Baylor University in August 2021. He's responsible for training, inspiring, and developing more than 200 future U.S. Army officers. He also has served as a professional soldier for more than 20 years, initially enlisting in the Army in 1999 before commissioning as a cavalry and armor officer in 2005. He served in numerous command and staff positions from the platoon to the Army staff level. His service in combat units includes positions of increasing responsibility from tank platoon leader, tank and HHC company commander, squadron operations officer twice, and brigade XO. He's served twice on general officers' personal staffs and was a strategic talent manager for armor colonels in the Senior Leader Development Office under the Office of the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. His awards and decorations include 2 Bronze Star medals, 4 Meritorious Service medals, the Valorous Unit Award, the Order of St. George Bronze Medallion, and the Order of the Gold Spur. He is deployed 3 times, including 2 years in combat in Iraq. Before we move on to the actual conversation, I want to say that first and foremost, we remember and honor all of the people lost in Vietnam, as well as in all of the wars and conflicts in which our country's been involved. And especially noting that we're having this event just a few days after Memorial Day. So I'd like to start with Marty and Travis. We began yesterday our rehearsal, and I think it's a good place to begin again today with the question, what made you want to be a member of the U.S. Armed Forces? And I'll ask Marty to go first.
Well, Colin, I was a high school dropout. I dropped out of high school with a year and a half to go, and I had no GED, I had no driver's license, I had no car. I worked some odd jobs. Actually, at one point, sold food to survive, sold nothing else. And so I looked at the military as a roof over my head, to be honest. 3 meals a day, some new clothes. I didn't have many choices, and my future did not look very bright at that point. So my options were limited. So that's basically why I went into the military. And another strong motivation was the GI Bill. I wanted to be able to go to school when I got out to college, and I knew that I could earn that GI Bill.
Thank you, Marty. Brendan, Travis, how about you next?
Well, I first want to say, I think Marty's story is just incredible. And it really blows the lid off this concept we had, at least back in the 70s, of the Vietnam veteran coming on. What a success story Marty is. And I was born 2 days before Pearl Harbor. So I really kind of grew up during that war. I remember a few things being said about it, but during World War II, but stories afterward and things I was seeing, I really grew up kind of liking military stuff. And later on, probably in the 50s, is when I started dreaming of becoming a fighter pilot. The old TV stations, hard to imagine that today, but they used to sign off at late in the evening, and they always concluded with the Star Spangled Banner. I mean, this was before midnight, so you'd watch those things, and later on they would have fighters flying in formation, or the U.S. Air Force demonstration team, the Thunderbirds. At that time, they were flying F-100s, is what I ended up being flying in Vietnam. But I just dreamed of being a fighter pilot, and I'd love military stuff also. I mean, I would have loved the Army probably as well, but I came to TCU to get in Air Force ROTC, and that was my dream. That's why I came to TCU, and I wanted to be in the military and wanted to be a fighter pilot.
So you both, for different reasons and coming from different directions, you both had motivations for joining the military, and you did join, and you both did go to Vietnam. And was serving in combat in Vietnam what you had expected it to be? Did it live up to your hopes, or did it change who you understood yourself to be? Or Travis, you seem to be picking up on that.
Well, certainly it was maybe more than what I expected it to be. I was wanting to fly fighters in Europe. That's what I thought I'd be doing. That's what most the great places would be, flying there. And but I was very well trained. I knew what I was doing. Our job was inherently dangerous as a fighter pilot. There were no smart bombs back then. And if we had troops in contact, they were usually pretty close to the enemy. So we had to be accurate, and that meant we had to fly low, 25, 50 feet to the ground a lot of times. And so that job was inherently dangerous. And I think being able to get focused was very important there. So maybe I've lost track of the question. Everything I expected to be, but then I don't know. It was more also, and it was being interesting, being faced with the issue of I think every person in combat feels this. How will I do my job? Will I be able to perform?
Yeah.
And Brandon had mentioned, we were talking yesterday about, the fear and overcoming the fear. And I think that was a big part of it. For me, it was more about having to be focused in order to do my job. There was no place for fear. I had to be focused if I was going to survive doing the job itself. So I think that's something that I learned from it and learned about myself in it.
Yeah. Thank you, Travis. Marty, how about you? What was Vietnam all you expected it to be?
Well, that and more. It was quite a blast for me. I was proud to be a combat engineer. I remember when I stepped off the airplane at Benoit Air Base when I landed in Vietnam after about a year of intensive training, very good training. I stepped off that plane. It was hot and humid. I didn't have a weapon. And I was aware that Benoit had been attacked by rockets and mortars and actually had a frontal assault in 1967. So as I stepped off that plane, my first thought was, where do I get my hands on an M16? I feel very vulnerable. And so other than just being a tremendously hostile place, throughout the mid to late 60s, where there had been so many casualties coming home, I was afraid. I'll be honest. I was afraid. I didn't know exactly what to expect or where I'd be going with what combat engineer unit. So in a way, there was just a lot of anticipation. I was 18 years old. I really didn't know what to expect, except for I knew that there was going to be hostility. I knew it was going to be dangerous. And in some ways, by my training, I was prepared for that.
Yeah, thank you, Marty. So Lieutenant Colonel Brandon Sultwish is younger than the other two gentlemen. He served more recently, and he's still serving in the U.S. Army as the commander at TCU and of Air Force cadets at TCU and Baylor. Brandon, why did you join the military?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I joined because I grew up I was in grade school. I think I was in 5th grade when I watched Desert Storm happen on TV. And I remember watching the nightly news, the precision, just the overwhelming power of the Army. And it seemed very prestigious. I remember the welcome home parades. I remember all of that as a kid. And, much like Travis, I grew up wanting to fly. I thought fighter planes were pretty cool. I think Top Gun happened in there somewhere, which probably made a lot of people want to fly fighter planes. And coming from Central Washington, a small agricultural town, it seemed like, I joined an army at peace in 1999. The only thing we really had going was Bosnia, doing some peacekeeping there. And it seemed like an adventure. It seemed like an opportunity to serve, to make something better of myself. And so I was happy to do it.
So you did later serve in combat. Did you having joined a peacetime army and then perhaps somewhat to your surprise having then found yourself in an army, or you didn't find yourself in an army at war, you joined again as an officer in 2005. So what was your motivation there?
Yeah, so it was interesting that I ended up earning a scholarship to go back to college, and I got out of the Army 2 weeks before 9/11 on contract to go to ROTC and come back as an officer. And so my first week, I think I was in my second or third day of classes in college, and 9/11 happened. And I remember very, very clearly, I went to my professor of military science doing my job at that point at Washington State University and said, hey, I've got to leave, I've got to get back. And he said, don't worry, this war will still be going by the time you get out of here. You just need to stay on this path. And he was more right than he knew at the time. But yeah, absolutely. From that point on, we knew we were an Army at war, and we were going to be at war for a while. And of course, we started as an Army fighting very shortly after that, within the next month in Afghanistan. But the invasion in Iraq didn't start till 2003, and that was a brand new conflict when I came in as a lieutenant. Really 2 years and heating up. And so our expectation from day one was that we were going to Iraq or Afghanistan, and we were going to fight.
Yeah. Let's circle back to Vietnam. And another question is, what, for the two older gentlemen, what was the most, what do you remember most about your time in Vietnam? And I think I'll start with Marty on that.
What I remember most, first of all, is the friends that I lost there. One of my best friends who had 10 days to go before he was to go home. His name's Don Huey, and he's on the Vietnam Memorial Wall. That's the first thing that comes to mind. Other than that, it was the things that I learned that was that I could survive in a hostile environment a lot better than I ever anticipated, that I had more strength and I had more courage and I had more determination than I ever realized, that I learned what fear was. And I thought I had known what fear was before I went to Vietnam, but I learned what fear actually was. I learned the sound of a bullet coming towards my head and past my head, that zing, as compared to a bullet going out over my head. When I first got there, the first few weeks, it freaked me out when I'd hear a bullet going out or a gun fired, and I didn't know what direction it was coming from. And the guys that had been there a little longer than me, quickly taught me to distinguish. And there is a distinct difference in the sound. I had bullets zinging past my head and tearing up, branches and stuff around me, and lots of guns going off behind me. So I learned to distinguish that. I learned to not survive and not blow myself up with booby traps and mines and things like that. And I learned how to handle fear and how to put that aside. And like Travis said earlier, just do the job that I was trained for.
Your job, the job you were trained for, included moving earth with heavy equipment during the invasion of Cambodia. Yeah.
The combat engineer unit, we were always in demand because we had heavy equipment. We had tools and equipment that other units did not have. And so they were always seeking us to help build bunkers and bridges and airstrips and roads and things like that. So oftentimes we were operating heavy equipment, but I was also attached to some other units, particularly during the invasion of Cambodia.
Tell us a bit more about your time in Cambodia.
Well, we knew that we were going somewhere about 24 hours in advance, and there'd been some talk about an invasion of Cambodia, and there was a lot of protests on American campuses across the country. People concerned that the war was expanding in Vietnam, and there were 200 or 300 coffins and body bags coming back every week from Vietnam. So there was a lot of fear, and there was a lot of anticipation. We had been inside Vietnam all along the Cambodian border in the Three Corps area in Central Highlands, and the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army kept coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail with supplies, and they would come in and hit us, and we couldn't do anything. We could chase them to the border, and we weren't supposed to go back in there. We did go in a few times, but we weren't supposed to be in there. And so on midnight of May 1st, 1970, we pushed in there as an invasion from several different points. We went in in the Parrots Beak area. And we were hit the first night that we went in there. We were hit by 2 a.m. and pinned down, and that went on for about 6 weeks. It was the bloodiest, most brutal time that I had during my 2 tours in Vietnam. It lasted about 6 weeks, and we lost a lot of guys, 326 to be exact, and over 1,500 were wounded during that 6 weeks. And we hear about the Kent State riots, where 4 students were unfortunately shot and killed by National Guard troops at Kent State University. And we seldom hear about the 326 that died during that time in Cambodia, or the hundreds that were wounded. And I think it's a tragedy what happened at Kent State, but I wish that the soldiers that had been ordered to go in and were following military orders and orders by our president would also be recognized for their contribution.
You've talked to me before about your exposure to news from the outside world, especially when you were in Cambodia, and how you'd get newspapers. Tell a little about that.
Yeah, I mean, this was way before the internet, cell phones and things like that, but we would get newspapers a few days late that would be sent over to us from home. And we were reading about the protests on college campuses and in the United States. And of course, we were there, we were risking our lives every day, and we were, in fear, and we were doing a job that we were ordered to do. And so we felt totally unsupported by the American people and by the college students on campuses. And it was really kind of a bad feeling to feel that you didn't have their backing. We felt like we had been fighting with our hands tied behind our back, and we'd run up to an imaginary line, which was the Vietnam-Cambodian border, and we had to stop. We couldn't finish the fight, and they'd hit us in guerrilla type warfare, and then they'd run back and hide in the jungles of Cambodia. So that was kind of an awful feeling. We would bury those newspapers, as with everything else that we had, like even gum wrappers, because the Viet Cong could creatively make booby traps with the foil wrappers of a stick of gum and use that as a conductor, and improvise with gravel and glass and pieces of pottery and explosive powder in say a bleach gallon bottle or a gallon milk jug, and they would fashion a triggering device out of a simple AA battery and the foil wrapper from a stick of gum as a conductor. And so we buried everything. We tried to not leave any trace of things that we had, and as we moved on, and we were moving quickly in Cambodia during that invasion.
Yeah, thank you, Marty. Before I move back to Travis, I want to note a couple of things. If you're an attendee and you need to cut out early, we're gonna run. We're probably going to run over time, and happily so, as long as there are questions and interest. We'll be here. But if you, an attendee, need to leave, you can know that there's going to be a recording of this on YouTube. So anything that you miss, you can watch later. Also, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section here, and they'll be given to me, and we'll address them. So please do submit questions. Travis, what was your most memorable event, or what about your time in Vietnam is most memorable to you 50 years later?
Well, Marty had said earlier about Benoit, where I was and where he flew into, and I was there in '67, and we were attacked from the war was everywhere, all around the country, and air bases were targets for rockets and mortars. But at the sound of, certainly the sound of outgoing, big army base was joined us, and artillery units. The war went on 24 hours a day, and there were always cannons firing at night. I think that one of the things I remember is that distinguishing between the artillery fire going out and that was coming in occasionally, being able to sleep while it was going out, is just disregard those sounds. But I remember, combat time, and tracers flying by the cockpit at night on a mission to support guys like Marty on the ground. That was our mission. The fighter pilots in the Air Force were the point of the spear. So we were out trying. Our job was to protect guys like Marty, so they could, when they came under attack, we could respond quickly. So I remember those kind of things a lot. But I think the thing I remember the most, I've carried with me the most, was our camaraderie, the band of brothers experience. We were all fighter pilots, were officers. I was the only lieutenant, but we were pretty tight, close-knit group, and dedicated to our job, dedicated to the grunts, the guys on the ground. And after that camaraderie is something that was very strong in a fighter squadron, and we still have reunions today. You know, I'm 80 years old, and these other guys are all older than I, and in their mid 80s, and so we still get together and send emails back and forth, and that's something that I carry the most, I think, back from Vietnam.
And Ethan, I want to add that guys like Travis saved our bacon more than once. I mean, those F-100 Super Sabres and the Phantoms and Cobra gunships and things like that. I mean, we worshiped those guys. They were angels to us, because when they came in, all hell broke loose, and we were a hell of a lot safer after they were pulling out.
Yeah. It's interesting to have the two of you on the panel talking about each other's work and how important it was to each of you. Travis, you were there during the Tet Offensive, and there may be people here who are not fully aware of the Tet Offensive and its significance in the history of the Vietnam War. Where were you when it happened, and what can you say about its significance?
Well, I had already flown my last mission. Pardon me. And I was getting ready to go home, and had a few days left when the attack came at night, and it was a big push, a big offensive by the North Vietnamese. They'd been building up for months, as we later realized. But about 2:00 in the morning on the Tet holiday, there was a stand down truce because of the Lunar New Year, that big celebration. It was called Tet.
And this is when?
It was in January, maybe 28 of 1968 was the first Tet Offensive. We had rockets and mortar attack. We all ran to our bunkers, and then started to realize that this was more. There was actually a ground invasion that breached the perimeter of the base. One thing I remember about it is, you know, I was guy talking to me about it. I was walking around in my shorts and a flak vest, wearing a steel pot helmet, and I had bought an AK-47, carrying that around, and there was a fight going on just outside our quarters in the town of Benoit, and we could distinguish between the American weapons and the AK-47 had a different sound. So I had an officer tell me, you know, Vanderpool, put that AK-47 away. They'll think, if somebody hears you shoot that, they'll think we're the enemy. The comment was, yeah, that's those. Wow. We don't want to distinguish that. These will be those guys over there. That's those Air Force pilots fighting with pistols and beer bottles. Kind of a joke later about it. We felt we were very vulnerable right at that time, and I'm sure like Marty felt a lot of times, you know, the war going on, and I climbed up on a water tower trying to watch it a little bit better, and realized I was getting shot at up there, so got down from that. Tet was, and I when I came home, I realized this just from the intelligence we knew, and I told people this was a last gasp offensive for North Vietnam. They were really trying to win a decisive battle and, you know, win the war back home, but it was a resounding defeat for them. In fact, at that time, and I think some stories are coming out now, new people are writing about this, that the president was being advised that by the military leaders that we have a chance to win now. We need to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail, occupy that, stop Haiphong Harbor from allowing ships and supplies to come in from the Russians and from the Chinese and other Soviet bloc countries. We can win this now. But for whatever reason, the president disregarded that advice. And then it ended up with the news media watching the war so closely. Brandon was talking about yesterday, Colonel Sultwish, about how brutal war is, and it is very brutal. And when it was coming into the homes of American people, it was hard for them to watch. And I think at some point Walter Cronkite came out and he was talking about things after Tet, and he made the comment, "This is a war that we can't win," sort of in closing. I think that created the attitude of the American people. Tet had a particularly strong point in changing public opinion, even though all of us that were there and the military understood that this had been a significant defeat for the North Vietnamese.
Well, and the publicity that the Americans were getting included video of all of the coffins, body bags coming back from Vietnam. Life magazine published an issue that had about 300 photographs of the servicemen that had been killed just that week. And I think they passed a law at some point saying you can't video, coffins coming back with a truck, big cargo truck loaded with them, and go to funerals and things like that and publish that because, and also not only that, but they were, some of the combat, we had journalists that were embedded with us and they would film the combat and photograph the combat that was going on in the villages with some of the villagers, and women and children were being killed and some of them were being injured severely by napalm, and people were watching that in the evenings in their living rooms, and it was too shocking. It was too much for them, and so I think that led to the turning of the attitude towards the Vietnam War. People don't want to see that in their living room. It's the horrors of it are not something that you want to view.
Yeah. So it's a good moment to turn back to Brandon, Colonel Sultwish, actually, and ask a couple of questions. One, how was your combat, your experience and memory of combat in Iraq? How does that compare to what you've been hearing today from Marty and Travis? And also maybe comment on the media, the role of the American media in the Iraq War.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. I think the first thing I would say is it's pretty shocking actually when you hear the experience of people in different wars, and I think it fundamentally comes down to the experience for soldiers on the ground in combat tends to be pretty similar. For me personally, I think I was 25 years old when I deployed to Iraq for the first time as a tank platoon leader, and we spent a period of that time on tanks, but then we quickly became infantrymen and, jumped on Humvees and started kicking down doors and fighting on the streets, dismounted. And I think there's a period where you've trained for that. You understand that it's real. There's no disillusion, or there's no, you understand that. But there's a point where someone gets injured, where there's violence all around you, where you realize someone's shooting at you, and there's a moment, at least for me, the first time that I had bullets hit about a foot over my head, and I realized, oh wow, somebody's trying to kill me. And then the first time you see somebody on your, in your unit who's injured or killed, that picture in your head of, oh wow, this person who I've known and I've trained with and I've been at barbecues with, and now all of a sudden they're over there bleeding out, screaming, and chaos is happening all around me. And oh my God, this is real.
Yeah.
And there's that. And then moments later, you channel that back in and you just do your job. And I think that becomes the reality of that experience for every soldier is, fear is there, violence is there, but at some point to survive in that, you have to be focused. You have to revert back to your training. And I think that when you talk to a lot of soldiers, it's about your training because you revert back to how good you were when you were training beforehand. And it's about just caring about the people to your left and right, because that's everything in your world in those moments. So I would just say, my experience is a lot of what they're talking about. It's very similar. It's a different place, but it 25 years removed maybe, or 30 years removed, but it's the same experience.
You want to comment at all on the media coverage of the Iraq War?
Yeah. So I think it's interesting, and it's terrible. Just to think back now, I mean, the kind of your opening comments to think, the thing that I've noticed with my soldiers, the people that I've served with, my friends, my colleagues, and me personally is, now I'm 17 years removed from my first deployment, and it was to Mosul, Iraq, and we left Mosul and it was taken back over by Al Qaeda, and they had to go back in and that whole thing. And you start to ask these questions, these big existential questions of what was it all for? And that's never easy, but I'll tell you that it's probably a lot easier for me than it was for them, because I had people who openly thanked me and who were supportive of me, and I didn't have to hide the fact that that had been part of who I was. I wasn't ashamed of the time that I'd spent there. I didn't have to have that. And so it's terrible to me that we allowed ourselves as a society to do that to Vietnam veterans, and the media is a huge part of that. And I don't begrudge the media. They do an incredibly important job of telling the story of war. I will say on the flip side of that, I had embedded journalists with me who were incredible Americans, who were out there putting themselves at just as much risk as we were every single day to tell the story, to tell our story, and to share with people back home what is happening. And I think that it's the responsibility of the regular American citizen to consume that, to force themselves to watch it. Because if I could share an anecdote very quickly, I've had several experiences in my career over the last 20 years of people who I care about, who are very invested in me, invested in my family, who know absolutely nothing about the world and know nothing about truly what I do or what I've done. And so the anecdote I'll share with you is, I came back as a lieutenant, having just served in Iraq, and I went to the wedding of a fraternity brother up in the Seattle area. And we went out on the patio in the reception, and one of my fraternity brothers looked at me and said, "Man, so what was it like? Was it hard? Did people shoot at you?" And I said, "Yes, people did shoot at me." And he goes, "Oh my God, did you shoot back?" And I said, "Yes, I did. If I didn't, I would be really bad at my job." I mean, yeah, we did. That's what I do. You know that. And he goes, "Yeah, I just didn't realize, I guess, that's what you were really doing over there." And at the same time, his wife walked out on the patio and said, "Hey, what are you talking about? Don't talk about that. That's a downer. Don't ruin the evening." And so, there's still this experience of, there's kind of a curiosity, but there's that line there where people, I think it's just hard. It's not something that we're comfortable with. And I think that you could even look at Ukraine and Russia now, and my goodness, we have people talking on their cell phones as bombing is happening around them on the nightly news. And you can feel the anxiety that brings in people. And it's hard for people to hold that. And so I think the media does a good job of helping people understand that, because if we are going to take the step of sending soldiers into combat, then we need to be very clear-minded about what we're sending them to do. And there's nothing worse than being in combat and wondering if people support you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Brandon. We've got several questions from audience members, and I'll pick one of them up first for Travis and Marty. When you returned home, how difficult was it to get back to your civilian life?
Good question. Kind of tagging on what Brandon said, the reception that we received as Vietnam veterans coming back from Vietnam was not a good one. There were veterans that were spit at, drinks thrown on them, called baby killers and so forth. And we didn't talk about it much when we came back. It's kind of trendy right now to say, thank you for your service, but I didn't hear that for 20 years. And when I hear it now, what it does is it reminds me of the reception that we had when we came back. I think it's a reaction to the guilt that maybe some sons and daughters of Vietnam veterans felt about the way Vietnam veterans were treated. We didn't have the welcome committees and airports with signs and things like that, welcome home. We just blended into society. And it was hard. I probably had PTSD the first 2 or 3 years, had nightmares recurring for several years, freaked out when I was driving down the road. If there was some disturbance or the road had been patched or repaired and thunder would put me down on the floor. I just got busy. Ethan, I got in college, an open door policy at a community college and got a job working in a hospital. And so I just got busy and blended in as best I could.
Yeah. Travis?
Well, let me say first, just kind of piggyback on something that about Colonel Sultwish, Brandon, what he does and what has been done for a long time at TCU with the leaders of the Air Force and Army ROTC. We had a lot of guys that were in Army and Air Force ROTC back in the early and mid 60s. Guys just like me that were training, you know, the draft was out there, but this was an option. And Brandon and the other commanders of the detachments, Air Force ROTC and Army ROTC, that Brandon commands, went through that program. We were trained well. We learned discipline, and I think it's really special. We had a lot of TCU guys that went to Vietnam in the mid 60s, 70s. Some of them, the excellent promo email that came out from TCU Magazine, TCU Alumni Association showed the very poignant photo of a plaque in the Veterans Plaza at TCU, and it had the names of 4 TCU guys that were killed in Vietnam. I didn't know George Marcos, or he was the first Tarrant County fatality, I think, or John Olson. He was a little later, and both Army guys. 2 of the Air Force guys, both fighter pilots, Elmo Powell and Mitch Sadler, were killed over there. I mean, those are guys at TCU that I knew well, socially and intramural academic areas. So there are a lot of guys that served. Some like guy Randy Howard was the starting quarterback on our football team in '64. He went over as a helicopter pilot and was wounded. Great guy. Steve Nance is another guy, a good friend of mine. Was an armored guy like Colonel Sultwish. His unit, he was a platoon leader, just like I think Brandon was. An armored unit, but have come back and done well. I came back as an instructor pilot out in Lubbock. So he did Reese Air Force Base then. I didn't experience the abuse, but I knew that was around. I was in a military unit, and so we were all, very much part of training to continue on. And I'd see things on the news, and I would talk about experiences out there. But when I got out of the Air Force and came back to SMU to go to law school, it was a different environment. People were younger. It wasn't hostile, but I just didn't feel comfortable talking about it. And I didn't. I just pressed on with my life, and I think adjusted comfortably to where I was. But I didn't talk about Vietnam for a long, long time.
Yeah. Marty, you talked, I want Marty for you to address a couple of things that we talked about yesterday. One, the first time you personally, Marty, were told thank you for your service. And also we wanted to make sure to talk about Agent Orange today.
The first time that I was told thank you for your service was in a church service here in Fort Worth, Texas, when all the veterans were asked to stand up, and on Veterans Day. It would happen to be on Sunday. And the minister thanked the veterans for their service, and I believe the people in the church applauded or something. That was the first time, and that was after 20 years that anybody said that to me. Now, when people say it to me today, I told you, it reminds me of the reception that we received and the fact that we didn't hear it for 2 decades. But I'm courteous, I'm not rude, and I thank people for saying that to me, but it creates mixed feelings inside of me. And what was the second part of your question, Ethan?
Agent
Oh,
Orange. Yeah.
I don't know if you mentioned at the beginning of the introduction that over 58,000 soldiers died in Vietnam in direct combat conflict, and that 3.8 human beings died in that conflict.
3.8 million human beings.
3.8 million, yes, that's what I meant to say, I'm sorry. But also, people may be unaware that over 300,000 Vietnam soldiers have died of the effects of the chemical agent orange, which has toxic, deadly toxic dioxins and PCBs that reside in your tissues and in your skeleton, your bones for the rest of your life. And there's 18 medical conditions that are presumptively connected with Agent Orange exposure, and 6 or 7 of them are bad cancers, rare cancers, some you've never heard of, and a number of other conditions. I'm currently having difficulty with my legs with peripheral neuropathy as my nervous system is degraded gradually by the Agent Orange, my hands and forearm. So I can't stand in courtrooms anymore and try cases that are multiple days where I'm on my feet. I can't teach at TCU and other universities now 3-hour courses because I've got to sit down. My legs just can't take it. And so there are just a number of Vietnam veterans that have died, and a number of them that are far worse off than I am. I've been told to be prepared to be in a wheelchair, but I'm fighting it like hell. I got rid of my yard guy and I mow my own yard. It takes me 3 days. I bought a fancy recumbent bike and I practically lay down and I pedal that, try to strengthen my legs. I'm a fighter. I'm still a fighter, and I will continue to be that way. And I'll be hell on wheels if I'm in a wheelchair. But I just want to recognize those 300,000 that continue, and soldiers that continue to die from their wounds in Vietnam.
Yeah, and that's more than 50 years afterwards. We've got several more questions I want to make sure at least to touch on. One is from my co-editor of the book Voices of America, April Brown, who's TCU's Director of Veteran Services. April says, I believe your stories allow people to reflect, support, and build community for our military community. How can the TCU community continue to share these important stories and support our veterans? Maybe any of the panelists could address that.
Well, since I'm a TCU vet, yeah, I appreciate how that there's an office for veteran services. That's a really good thing that TCU has, and so I think today that's being addressed much better. And I think that's a different attitude of the American people today. I would just say continue to remember and honor their participation. I don't know if I would say something about the reasons for that reception and what was going on. Vietnam was a war that we weren't attacked. It was part of our policy, and it had been policy for since Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy. And ultimately Johnson pressed that policy forward, but it was not something that the American people could necessarily accept. So it was a different time, especially after the news started coming back. I think today the American public is much more accepting and have learned to do that of veterans. And so if April's questions about what TCU can do, I think continue doing what you're doing. I think that's a very good thing, very different than it was for veterans, even TCU veterans coming back home. Not that we were really rejected. It was just kind of like it was benign neglect, I suppose.
Yeah.
April Brown is an absolute champion at TCU. She's a distinguished officer and veteran herself, but she has led an effort there that's just really, really commendable. She has a yearly recognition veterans and has guest speakers come in. And she mentors many of the young people, the veterans on campus, and a great teacher. I mean, I just can't say enough about April Brown. She's terrific.
Well, ditto to everything that Marty just said about April. I agree wholeheartedly.
Add one more thing too, Ethan.
Yeah.
So there's a really great endowed chair in the history department. So Dr. Karavuic is the Lance Corporal Benjamin Schmidt Endowed Chair for the Study of Conflict, War, and Society is, I think, the title. And Kara is such a champion for the military community and helping connect people in an academic dialogue around war and conflict and society, and really focuses on people and their experience in those conflicts. And she holds a annual symposium that's sponsored by Lance Corporal Schmidt's parents, who was a TCU graduate or a TCU student who dropped out and was killed in Afghanistan in a friendly fire incident. She is such a champion and just really, really is passionate about that mission. And so I think the TCU community, just wrap your arms around the work that both it sounds like April is doing, and also around what Kara is doing. I think that she would be very, very thankful for some support from the community with that. Those are powerful events that pull people from all around the country into TCU to talk about these really important things.
Yeah, right on. Another question we just got in was, I was unaware of the veterans programs at TCU. As a veteran and TCU alum, I'd love to become more involved in this. Can I get more information, please? And I think I can answer that very quickly and effectively by saying, be in contact with April Brown, the Director of Veteran Services at TCU, and she will happily accept your involvement and point you in the right direction. So please be involved. And I want to echo as well what Brandon said about Kara Vuic and her endowed chair in the history department. It's a fantastic thing that TCU has going. We're getting close to the end of the hour, but as I said earlier, I think those of us on the panel will happily stick around afterwards if there's more conversation to be had. I think I'd like to address the next and possibly last question to Brandon. What do you teach future Army officers at TCU and Baylor? What do you teach them about Vietnam?
I think that the most important thing that we can teach our future officers is that history repeats itself, and that we learn as soldiers and professionals from learning about what's happened before. So we do a lot around history. ROTC students have to take history courses as part of the curriculum, but more broadly in the senior year, we teach battle analysis, which is really teaching young officers how to study history and to make the appropriate learning and the appropriate insights out of history. Hopefully that helps us, not repeat some of the same things that happened, but in the event that history does rhyme, that we continue to do it better, and with the hope that that study, that effort, will make us better prepared to lead our nation's sons and daughters in combat, because ultimately that's what we're training people to do. And I would say that the other thing is, I think it's an incredible responsibility to teach people to be a combat leader. And one of the things that I tell our officers is, as a lieutenant, you are there to be the moral compass. Above everything else, you need to be competent, you need to be capable, you need to be all the things that you need to be, but you are there to make the right decision. And sometimes the right decision means doing things to take care of people. And sometimes making the right decision means making a hard decision to put people that you love in harm's way. But war is full of ambiguity and hard choices. And more than anything, our officers need to learn that what they do matters. And it matters not just for the soldiers they lead, but for the people in the countries that they're fighting in, and for a lot of other reasons. And so I think, there's a lot of lessons in Vietnam about people who serve very honorably, and a lot that we've learned and will continue to learn from that conflict.
Yeah, thank you. Is there anything that any of the panelists want to add that we haven't touched on? I feel like we had a great conversation yesterday just among the 5 or 6 of us. What have we not talked about today?
I had something, Ethan, that I think about understanding the public's understanding about the war in Vietnam that I think is changing today. There's some new authors, or I may have touched on that, are writing about certainly the Tet Offensive, but also the purpose behind Vietnam. I think the conventional message or understanding or narrative about how wrong it was to intervene in Vietnam or do what we did is just wrong. And I believe that we had an honorable purpose. The problem was we didn't have a strategy to win. And the Cambodian issue that was Marty mentioned when they went into Cambodia, that should have happened in 1967. And we should have stopped the flow of arms down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We should have stopped things in Haiphong Harbor. And I think that truth is starting to be presented today. We could have ended that much earlier had we had a strategy to win. And I think I would really encourage people to seek out information, new things that are coming out today. I've seen advertisements for some. I won't mention it, but I will if you want me to. But new things are coming out. Do you want me to say?
Sure.
Well, I just had seen an advertisement and went to find it. It's actually by respected newsman, a really qualified journalist, Brett Baer. It's entitled "The Unauthorized History of the Vietnam War." It's actually on Fox Nation. You have to be a subscriber to go see it, but I think you can get trial subscriptions and maybe go look at it. But it is really good. It's a 5-part series, an excellent piece on that I think is showing some. He has discussion with some authors that are talking about this, that have done studies and bringing out new information that because of a lot of circumstances about what happened, how we got into it, and the attitude of the news media, you're doing their job, but how the attitude that was developed it developed a wrong narrative about the Vietnam War. So I would encourage people to take a look at that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Travis.
Ethan, yesterday you asked Travis and myself a question. You said you've both built very successful careers as lawyers. How did the military help you succeed in the civilian world? And I'd like to address that if we have time.
Please do.
For myself, Vietnam taught me determination. Vietnam taught me, it tempered me like, steel is tempered. So when I came back, I was much stronger. I went over an 18-year-old. When I came back, after those 2 tours, I probably had the maturity of about a 30 or 40-year-old man. And so the determination to go to school, having the GI Bill, working. I got a job in a regional hospital, and I was working as an orderly all over the hospital, but particularly would go down to the emergency room when car wrecks and things would come in, and blood and fractures and things like that did not bother me a great deal. I did whatever job I had was there to do. And I was serious about school. After I graduated with an associate degree, I came to University of North Texas and completed a bachelor's with the GI Bill, a first master's degree with the GI Bill. Then I did a second one. I was waiting to go to law school, and I got a full scholarship to Texas Tech University Law School. And like Travis, I graduated 6 months ahead of my class. I was a very serious student, but I worked the whole way. So that discipline that you learn in the military helps you survive in the civilian world. It also helps you to be a leader. I was asked to join the Army Reserves. I had a secret clearance when I came back from Vietnam, but I was given In about a year, I was given a top secret clearance, and I worked in a classified underground intelligence and communications facility for 6 years. I served in, so I kind of had a slow transition from military back into civilian life.
Yeah.
I was a Texas prosecutor. I mentioned this too. I was a Texas prosecutor, and I used to get death threats, or defendants would threaten to kick my ass or something like that, and I just kind of chuckle it off.
Yeah.
You don't get afraid very easily.
Yeah. Thank you, Marty. There's another question from an audience member that's something we wanted to touch on anyway, which is, I think, a question mostly for Brandon. What is the biggest change you see in our military missions from the past?
Yeah, so I will answer that question at the beginning with kind of how the military has changed, and then go specifically to the missions. I think,
Yeah.
I think it'd be a shame not to point out that we've transitioned to the all volunteer force, and it's incredibly important as a country that we prioritize and we encourage good young people to serve. And that ebbs and flows at times, but I think that the American military is what it is because people volunteer and they're willing to raise their right hand and execute the mission when the call comes. But for people to do that, they have to be supported by their families. One of the biggest objections that we see to military service comes from family members. It comes from parents. It comes from close guardians and aunts and uncles in homes, and they don't see the military as being a path to a better life for their child or for their family member. And what I would tell you is that the all volunteer force has completely changed the way that people interact in that. And if you haven't met soldiers and veterans who are coming out, I encourage you to seek that opportunity out and just talk to some of the veterans about what they learned. And that comment that Marty made about being mature, I get that all the time. And, it really is, I think, true for many of our soldiers who are incredible young people who come out better prepared, not just to have been soldiers, but to lead in their communities. And in the ROTC program, I think people don't realize that only about 50% of the students serve on active duty. And 50% serve in the National Guard and in the reserves, and they go back out to serve in every other job in companies right next to you, but on the weekends, and when the call comes, they serve the country. That's really important.
Right.
So I just would encourage people to support people in service. And I think that to answer the question directly, how have the missions changed? I think that we are more globally engaged as a result of what we've seen over the last 30 years. And I think that in many ways we're trying to leverage our influence in many places over, all over the globe, and building relationships and creating partnerships in ways that we'll never fight alone again. And that's really important. I think people get frustrated and say, why do we have soldiers in Somalia? Why do we have soldiers in the Philippines? Why do we have soldiers in South America? What are we doing there? We're building partnerships. We're providing capability, and we're preventing the next war from happening. And so I would say that to the greatest extent that we can control it. And so I would just say that that in many ways, our Army is incredibly busy. So the average soldier now is deployed for about a third of their career to somewhere in the world. And that's, training in deterring aggression in Europe or in South Korea. And we are very much forward positioned and prepared to address any conflicts that arise. So I think that's different.
Thank you.
Ethan,
Yeah.
I would like to comment as a ground soldier on the changes that I have seen. We did not have drones. We did not have satellites. We did not have smart bombs. We did not have laser guided or infrared guided weapons. When it was overcast, a lot of times we couldn't get in close air support because they didn't know exactly where we were and where the enemy was. And so it's gotten to be much more technical, much more sophisticated. I like to say we fought the old-fashioned way. the airplanes that Travis was flying compared to the airplanes today are so much more sophisticated today. And so it's a technological, the technological advances have just been amazing.
Yeah, thank you, Marty. I want to,
On that, Ethan, just
yeah,
after I got back and when I was a lawyer and would go play in charity golf tournaments or something, I would get on a golf cart and realize that the golf cart had GPS and better navigation aids than I had at an F-100 in Vietnam.
yeah. I want to address another comment from an attendee and also share an anecdote of my own that came to mind during this conversation. Robin Ross, an attendee, said, "I appreciate Brendan Sultwish's comments about media and Americans' responsibility to pay attention." And I want to echo that. I want to sort of emphasize that the responsibility of Americans to pay attention, because that gets very personally back to my own motivations. I grew up in a pretty idyllic, all-white small town in Wisconsin, and it was a great place to grow up. My father took me to Haiti when I was 16 years old. That's a long story, worth telling some other time. But it exposed me to the outside world, and it also forced me to face my own responsibility to pay attention to the world in general, and to my own responsibilities as a citizen of this country. And I think that's and doing that over the 40 years since I first went to Haiti has been a difficult thing to do. It's difficult to pay attention. It's difficult to continue paying attention because it is painful, and learning is hard. It's easier to not learn, right? So if that's any recommendation I can offer, I think it's worth the effort. But it's also a duty that those of us who are civilians have to our fellow citizens who are serving in the armed forces, to pay attention to the involvements that our country has worldwide, and to the experiences of our service members and veterans. I also wanted to share this anecdote. Oh, sorry, did somebody?
Oh, sorry, no, I didn't mean to interrupt your anecdote. I can wait till after.
Well, the anecdote. No, you go first. Then I'll do my anecdote.
Yeah, so I just wanted to follow up on that comment, and I was reading on the chat on the side. There was a in recognizing that we're following and watching what's happening overseas, but also in asking the question why. Why are we there to begin with? And I 100% agree. So I would just offer this, that the soldier doesn't ask why. The soldier just follows orders and goes where they're told to serve. So the lieutenant colonel, the one-star general is there to execute a mission, and we're thinking, and we aren't robots, but the larger geopolitical questions in many ways are the responsibility of our government. And that's foreign policy and setting some of the strategic goals. And so I think that hits the nail on the head. We have to ask the question why.
Yeah.
Because when you hear the stories of soldiers that have served, the consequences are too high when we get it wrong.
Yeah.
So we have to be willing to fight for something. We can't not fight, but we have to know what we're fighting for. And I believe that the soldiers will do their part. They will fight where they're told to fight. But I think that citizens need to consume that media and need to ask the question why, and need to hold our elected, leaders responsible to be able to articulate why we are doing what we're doing.
Well, indeed. Thank you, Brandon. And that actually gets very, very directly to my anecdote. Thank you for that setup. 10 or 12 years ago, and I was involved. Long story. I got to know a colonel who had been in charge of the Army Corps of Engineers in Afghanistan. And he was back stateside in Portland, Oregon, which is just, as you know, from this area just down the road from Seattle, where I live. So I met this colonel at a dinner party and got to know him. We became friendly, and he told me the one time he was doing a public talk in Portland. He'd been invited to give a talk, and he was on his way to give his talk, and he was walking down the street in Portland in uniform, and a woman accosted him and started yelling at him and saying, and anti-war things, and we shouldn't be in Iraq, we shouldn't be in Afghanistan. You work for me. She kept saying, you work for me, you work for me. And he politely ignored her, tried to be polite as he hurried towards his event where he was the speaker. And finally, he, I guess, couldn't take it anymore. He turned around and he said, ma'am, I don't work for you. I work for the President of the United States, and he works for you. If you've got a problem, you talk to him.
So true.
Good point.
Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah.
Hey, Ethan, could I wanted to mention,
Yeah.
talking about what TCU could do. I want to thank the TCU Magazine, the Alumni Association, for having this program. I think it has certainly been very helpful to me and as a Vietnam veteran. So thank you to TCU and TCU Magazine and the Alumni Association for doing it and inviting me to participate.
And I want to thank my fellow panelists and also you, Ethan. You and I go back a little ways. Thank you very much for doing this.
Well, and thank you, all of you gentlemen, and the Alumni Association and the magazine. It's been these last couple of days getting to know all of you has been a real pleasure for me. Marty, as you pointed out, you and I go back some years now. Marty's one of the people. One of the great benefits to me of doing that book, Voices of America, was some friendships that came out of it, and I consider Marty to be one of those. There's certain people who really made an impression on me from that project, and Marty certainly is one of those. I'm going to put in a plug as well that for the article by Lisa Martin in TCU Magazine, and perhaps Carolyn could maybe post the link to that article. It was published in an issue of TCU Magazine in 2021, and it's about the book that April and I co-edited, Voices of America, Veterans and Military Families Tell Their Own Stories. It's I've written enough journalism in my day to recognize good journalism when I read it, and that article has all the marks of what good journalism should be. It's a really, really terrifically written and reported piece of journalism. Lisa Martin, the writer, clearly listened very well and carefully to everybody that she interviewed, including me and April, but also several of the veterans who were featured in the book. So I'm very proud to have done that book. Proud to be associated with April Brown, really above all, perhaps, and grateful to Carolyn Collier and the magazine for covering us in that way. We probably should wrap up now. I'd love to go on for another hour, but we're over time. The questions have been fantastic. The panelists have really been first rate, extremely thoughtful. I've greatly enjoyed my time with all of you. Travis and Brandon, I hope I get to meet both of you in person one day.
Yes, I hope so too.
And Marty, I can't wait to see you again next time I'm in Fort Worth.
Maybe I'll come to Seattle again.
Please do.
You're always welcome here, you know that.
Yeah, I do know that. I feel very welcome at TCU, and I miss it.
We have a guest room too for you if you need it.
Oh, thanks, Marty. I'll take you up on that. All right. Well, I don't know what the protocol is for fading out, but I'll stick around as long as I'm needed. Brandon, thank you very, very much. Colonel Sultwish, thank you for the leadership and education that you give cadets at TCU and Baylor. Marty, thank you. Travis, thank you.
Thank you, Ethan.
And
Thanks,
thank you to everyone who came. Yeah.
See you guys.